Hello there, and thank you for stopping by my channel. Wherever you are, whether you're winding down from a long day or just needing a little bit of peace and quiet, you've made it to the right place. Breathe easy and get comfortable, for this time is your time and yours alone. Let the soft noise of the world drift out of reach as you feel your body slowly sink into a deep, deep drowsiness. This is your time to relax. Today, I will be rambling about the haunted town of Bhangarh Fort, cursed by a heartbroken wizard for the rest of eternity. However, before we ramble our way to a deep sleep, I would love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always so interesting to see who's joining from all around the world. And now, dim the lights, take a sip of ice-cold water, and sink deeper and deeper into that oh-so-warm comfort, and join me as we discuss this cursed fort. Tucked beneath the low, rolling hills of the Aravalli Range, in a quiet corner of Rajasthan rests a place few locals dare to speak of after dusk. Its gates rise slowly from the ground like the ancient bones of something that once lived, now crumbled into its own forgotten silence. This place is called Bhangarh Fort, just outside the modern town of Alwar, surrounded by stretches of dry grass and scrubland. The remains of Bhangarh do not appear unusual at first. Its stone archways and time-worn walls are softened by age. Monkeys sit sleepily along parapets. Occasionally, a wind stirs through the cracked courtyards and breathes across the stone carvings. It is a place of stillness. A stillness so complete that even birds do not fly overhead. Locals say the air does not carry sound the same way within the fort. Some say it doesn't carry prayer. The history of Bhangarh begins around the late 16th century. Built by Bhagwant Das, a ruler of Amber, the fort was meant as a residence for his son, Madho Singh. At its height, it was a full settlement, complete with temples, homes, markets, and beautiful palaces. The fort, made of sandstone, once shimmered in the golden hours before sunset. But despite its architectural beauty, what has drawn attention for centuries has not been its form, but rather its emptiness. Within a few generations, Bhangarh was abandoned. Some say famine drove people away. Others whispered that the town never had a chance, that it was marked for quiet ruin from the very beginning. The most well-known legend speaks of a tantric, a kind of dark sorcerer who became enchanted by the princess of Bhangarh, Ratnavati. She was known across the region for her calm demeanor and soft features. When the tantric saw her at the market one day, he fell into obsession. He attempted to bind her love through the use of a magical oil, one that would make her fall for him against her will. But she discovered his plan. As the tale goes, she threw the cursed oil onto a nearby stone, which then rolled toward the tantric, crushing him beneath its weight. In his final breaths, he uttered a curse, that the fort and all within it would fall into lifeless ruin, that no soul would ever find peace there again. Whether one believes in curses or not, the town was indeed deserted not long after her death. And from that time on, people have whispered of strange things happening among the ruins. The area was declared off-limits after sunset by the Archaeological Survey of India. A sign posted by the gate asks visitors to leave before dark. No reasons are given. They never are. In the warm light of morning, you might find an old caretaker sweeping near the temple grounds. He will not speak of what he's heard. He simply shakes his head when asked. In the past 100 years, there have been dozens of recorded accounts by both locals and curious travelers. The stories are rarely loud. They are almost always quiet, fleeting, described in hushed tones. And yet they return again and again, the same images, the same sounds, like gentle echoes from something far beneath the stone. One of the earliest modern encounters comes from the 1930s, when two men from Jaipur attempted to stay inside the fort overnight. They brought blankets, food, and a lantern. According to records written later by one of their sons, the men set up camp in the main courtyard just past the Hanuman temple. The first few hours were uneventful, though both said they felt an odd weight in the air, like a pressure in their chests. Around midnight, one of the men went to relieve himself behind a nearby pillar. When he did not return, the second man followed. What he described later was simple but chilling. His friend had fallen. His face was covered in blood from a head wound. He had no memory of slipping. The man recovered but refused to ever return. He would not speak about what happened beyond that night. To this day, no one knows whether he saw something. Another story comes from the early 1990s. A group of 3 college students from Delhi entered the fort after dark, slipping past the gate after the guards had left. They were armed with cameras, flashlights, and a small tape recorder. Their goal was not ghost hunting. They simply wanted a thrill. Their tapes were later recovered. In one recording, you can hear them laughing. The sound of shoes crunching over dust. Then quiet. Long, drawn-out quiet. One of them whispers, "Did you hear that?" The tape continues for several minutes with only breathing and the occasional click of the flashlight. Then, very softly, something that sounds like a woman's voice. Just 2 or 3 words, spoken in what experts later described as a dialect of ancient Rajasthani. The tape ends not long after. The boys returned safely but described feeling disoriented, as if they had lost time. One claimed his watch had stopped. Another said he heard footsteps behind him throughout the walk, though no one was there. In 2005, a tourist from Germany named Eric Muller visited Bhangarh on a solo photography trip. He stayed until dusk, photographing the carved balconies and sun-warmed walls. He later published a small memoir of his trip in which he recounts walking into the old women's quarters near the rear of the palace. He described a heavy sense of dread, as if he had entered someone's bedroom uninvited. The room had no ceiling. He looked up and saw nothing but sky. As he turned to leave, he claims he saw a figure watching him from the far corner of the room. The shape was small, almost like a girl crouching. The face, he said, was not clear, but the mouth appeared to be open. Very wide. Too wide. When he moved closer, she vanished. His photographs of that room show nothing unusual except one. In one image, there's a shadow in the corner where no shadow should be. It appears to curl inward as though trying to hide. There are also stories from villagers in nearby Gola Bas. One woman, now in her 70s, said that when she was a child, her uncle went into the fort to retrieve a goat that had wandered inside. It was early evening. The sun had just dropped behind the hills. He was gone less than 15 minutes. But when he returned, she said, his hair had turned almost completely white. He did not speak for 2 days. Some stories are even quieter than that. Stories of smells, of music, of feelings that drift in and out like fog. People have reported the scent of perfume inside the royal chambers. But the scent comes without wind, without explanation. Others have spoken of hearing the faint thump of tabla drums echoing down the stone hallways, though no performers have stepped foot inside for generations. A group of American travel bloggers wrote in 2017 about a visit to the fort during monsoon season. The clouds had rolled in and dimmed the sky. As they walked along the back wall, one member of the group stopped to take a photo through a small arched window. She said she saw eyes staring back at her from within the frame. Not a face, not a full body, just 2 eyes. When she turned, there was nothing there. When she looked back at her phone, the screen had gone black. That phone never turned on again. An Indian filmmaker shooting a documentary in 2012 described strange audio interference during interviews near the central courtyard. Each time the crew passed a particular temple, the one nearest the collapsed market, the audio spiked. Not with static, but with what sounded like faint whispers. They could never isolate the source. Visitors have also reported sudden drops in temperature. One couple claimed the air around them grew cold as they approached the back steps of the women's quarters. It was late afternoon in July. The heat had been unrelenting until that moment. Then, in less than a minute, it grew chill enough to raise goosebumps along their arms. The air returned to normal just as quickly. A small sign in Hindi posted just outside the main gate asks simply, "Do not enter after sunset." There is no mention of why. But when you ask the older vendors at the base of the hill, they will tell you softly that Bhangarh is not empty. It only looks empty. The walls remember. The silence is full. While the royal palace within Bhangarh is where most visitors tread first, those who stay long enough soon wander toward the temple clusters. Scattered around the fort's central axis are several small stone temples, once filled with music, prayer, and incense, now hollowed by time and dust. Among them are the temples of Gopinath, Hanuman, Samshwar, and Keshavrai. These are some of the oldest structures on the site, and many believe they remain the most active. It is near these temples that some of the fort's most unnerving sightings have been reported. The Hanuman temple, closest to the entrance, holds a particular weight. Even in daylight, some say the air feels too thick inside. Locals describe it as the place where prayers stop. They do not say this out of disrespect, they mean that something seems to pull the sound away. In 2010, a spiritual researcher from Mumbai visited Bhangarh with permission to observe overnight, a rare allowance granted only for a short window and only under heavy supervision. He and two others focused their attention on the temples, choosing to begin at dusk. They noted the absence of natural sounds. No bird calls. No breeze rustling in the nearby brush. Once past the temple threshold, their equipment began to falter. A recorder emitted a strange rhythmic pulsing. When played back later, it sounded like breath. Slow, deliberate breath. As they moved toward the Samshwar temple, they reported a ringing in their ears, a soft, droning tone that grew louder until they crossed back into open space. All three men described a sensation of being observed, though the area was completely still. Another visitor, a local guide, once reported seeing a figure kneeling at the entrance of the Gopinath temple early one morning. From behind, it appeared to be a man in a saffron robe had bowed. Thinking it was a sadhu, the guide approached with reverence. But when he came within several steps, the figure stood and vanished. Not in a blink, but slowly. As though fading into smoke. The guide left the site that day and did not return for several months. When he did, he refused to speak of the temple again. Many of the most consistent reports come not from tourists, but from those who work near the fort year-round. Guards, vendors, and sweepers have carried the burden of witnessing far more than they usually say. A former gatekeeper, now retired, once gave a quiet interview in 2015. His shift had been the late afternoon just before sunset. His duties included making sure all visitors had left before dark and helping to secure the gates. He mentioned that on several occasions he had seen shadows moving across the upper balconies of the palace long after the last guests had left. He described the movements as slow, human in shape, sometimes walking, sometimes standing. One time he claimed to see two figures walking side by side, then turning to face him. He could not see their faces, but the movement was deliberate. He stood frozen for several minutes before hurrying back to the outer gate. He never checked that wing again without a flashlight. Another time he heard what he described as ornamental chains rustling near the northern temple, a sound too specific to mistake. Like bangles swaying gently against stone. In 2008, a group of 3 priests attempted to perform a cleansing ritual at Bhangarh, believing the space to be under a lingering spiritual disturbance. They brought offerings, incense, and sacred ash. The ceremony began without issue. But halfway through, 2 of the priests began to feel nauseous and lightheaded. One collapsed. The other said he felt a tightness across his throat. The ritual was stopped and all 3 left the premises. When they were interviewed later, they refused to perform the rite again. One priest told the reporter, "This is not a place for removal. It is a place of holding. Something is still kept here." There are also accounts from nearby field workers and shepherds whose animals will often avoid paths that run close to the outer walls. One goat herder from Gudabog, a hamlet nearby, told a quiet story in 2001. He said he was walking along the eastern edge of the fort one morning before sunrise, following one of his goats that had wandered off. He claimed to hear the sound of water being poured into a metal vessel, a sound he knew well. It was coming from inside the crumbling ruins near the stepwell. When he turned the corner to look, there was no one there. But the air smelled suddenly sweet like roses. The goat would not move forward. Its legs locked. He picked it up and returned home. He has never passed that wall again. Others report a different smell. Something musty, like wet fabric that has not seen the sun in years. It comes with no breeze, no source. Several visitors have spoken about the sound of music coming from the fort long after hours. This is one of the most frequent modern claims. The music is usually described as soft, lute-like, or sometimes a female voice humming a melody that feels familiar but cannot be placed. In 2016, a travel photographer captured an overnight audio recording from the hilltop overlooking the fort. He had placed his microphone on a rock ledge facing the palace complex. On the recording, you can clearly hear a faint progression of musical notes, 6 in total, repeating in a slow, downward pattern. There are no villages close enough to explain it. When he returned the next month to try again, the sound was gone. Another visitor, a woman from Bengaluru, posted in a travel forum in 2021 about a soft tinkling of anklets she heard near the ruined garden paths. She had been walking with her brother and both turned quickly to find the source. There was no one there, but she insisted the sound came from behind them, not beside them. She described the feeling afterward as like being followed by memory. One of the more chilling modern stories involves a pair of eyes seen behind the windows of the women's quarters. A visiting couple, both professors, said they were walking along the far courtyard when the husband looked up toward the jagged remains of a once arched window. He saw a pair of eyes watching him. Large, still, pale. The light was just right for visibility. He called for his wife to look, but by the time she turned, the shape had shifted back into shadow. The man described the eyes as not angry, not sad, simply present, like they had always been there. Paranormal research groups have attempted to explore the fort, often without success. In 2019, a team brought full-spectrum cameras and electromagnetic sensors. Several devices picked up strong, fluctuating signals near the bathhouse structures. At one point, their camera caught a brief streak of movement, low to the ground, like fabric dragged across stone. When enhanced, the footage showed what appeared to be a translucent wisp moving from left to right, then disappearing at the base of the stairs. Another camera placed inside the collapsed market hall captured something unusual. Around 3 in the morning, a subtle shift in the dust. A light disturbance, as if someone had walked across the floor barefoot, though no one was inside. One footprint, then another, but only 2. The dust then settled, completely. The most visit Bhangarh during the day, a few leave with a lingering sense that something remains aware of their presence. Many speak of feeling watched, not from a particular direction but from the fort itself. as if the walls had developed senses of their own. One woman who wrote for a cultural magazine said she entered Bhangarh a skeptic and left confused. Her watch stopped working inside the palace. Her photos came out overexposed. She heard a child laughing behind her but saw no one. And then there are those who enter and say nothing happened. No chills, no sounds, only silence. But for some, even the silence is too much. Because Bhangarh does not show its presence to everyone. It waits. It listens. As you move deeper into Bhangarh's hollow remains beyond the palace and main courtyards, the land begins to feel different. The stone walkways give way to worn dirt trails. The shapes of the walls blur into weathered edges. It becomes more difficult to tell where the fort ends and the wild begins. But within this space, where structure meets decay, is where some of the strangest reports have surfaced. One of the lesser-known areas of Bhangarh is the stepwell, nestled just behind what was once a communal bathing space. These ancient wells were designed to store rainwater and were often sites of daily routine, a meeting place for women, servants, and families. At Bhangarh, the stepwell remains intact but strangely undisturbed. Unlike others across Rajasthan, this one is rarely visited, even by curious travelers. Some say animals avoid it. Others say it gives off a sensation of being submerged even when standing at its dry edge. Several people have described hearing water within the stepwell even during drought seasons. Not the trickling of groundwater, but the sound of pouring, as if someone were filling a basin just below the lip of the lowest step. And there is always something else, a kind of soft echoing, the kind heard in caves or old cisterns. But no sound bounces from the surrounding walls. It only seems to go inward. In 2007, a hydrologist from Jaipur visited the site to study its old water management systems. He was alone, recording notes near the edge of the stepwell when he felt what he called a soft vibration through the soles of his feet. No machinery was present. No one was nearby. When he looked down, the dust at the bottom step seemed to ripple. Just slightly. He left that day without finishing his measurements. He later returned with a team, but the phenomenon did not repeat. Just beyond the stepwell, past a set of partially collapsed stone pillars, lie the remains of the old bathing quarters. Visitors often miss them, mistaking the area for a pile of rubble. But if one follows the right trail, the stone basins are still visible. Most are dry, overgrown with pale green moss. The walls are crumbling. The air here is unusually still. According to locals, this area carries the deepest residual presence. Women from neighboring towns have said they will not walk this path even in daylight. One woman, now in her 80s, recalled visiting as a child with her uncle. As they passed the overgrown structure, she looked over the broken wall and saw what she described as a woman with no face combing her hair. She said the woman's hands were visible, her long braid moving slightly, but the space where her face should have been was only shadow. Not darkness. Shadow. A flat absence. The memory remained with her, though she never returned. A number of paranormal researchers have noted strange correlations between the moon phases and ghost reports within Bhangarh. While most casual visitors arrive during sunny afternoons, some have timed their presence to coincide with full moons, new moons, and lunar eclipses. What they've found, or at least what they claim, has added to the growing collection of unnerving accounts. During full moons, several witnesses have spoken of disorientation near the central garden. A foreign tourist once wrote that she lost track of which direction she had come from despite standing only a short distance from the main path. She walked in one direction for 5 minutes, turned around, and found herself facing an unfamiliar wing of the palace. Another visitor claimed he heard footsteps behind him that stopped whenever he turned around. The sound was distinct, dry sandals on stone, steady, measured, human. But no one was there. His photos from that visit came out blurred, though his camera worked perfectly before and after. Only those images taken near the garden on a full moon were unusable. Conversely, new moons when the sky is dark seem to bring different energies. One group of local boys sneaked in during a new moon in 2019. They made it to the top of the central palace hoping to see stars. While resting in silence, one of them noticed something out of place, a small glint of light in one of the doorways below. It flickered, then vanished, then returned, this time closer. They described it not as a flame or torchlight, but something smaller, like the reflection of a lantern in glass. But they were the only ones inside. No artificial lights were allowed. Within seconds, the light disappeared entirely. They ran. One of the boys later developed a deep fever with no diagnosed cause. He recovered but did not speak of that night again. There are also dozens of first-hand accounts from travelers who were not seeking ghosts. These stories are often the most convincing, told plainly by people who came for the architecture, the history, or the photography, only to leave unsettled. In 2013, a Canadian artist visited the fort to sketch its structures for a personal project. She sat for several hours near one of the far corners of the main palace, using charcoal and soft pastels. She described the mood as peaceful until she looked down and noticed that her sketch pad had been marked in areas she had not touched. Then, deliberate smudges as if a fingertip had dragged across the paper. She wiped it away and continued, only for it to return minutes later. She thought little of it until she returned home and reviewed her photographs. In one photo of the palace window, a faint outline of a face can be seen in the lower right corner. She had not seen anyone when the photo was taken. Another traveler, an engineer from Pune, visited with his family. He brought along an EMF detector for curiosity. While walking near the Hanuman temple, the detector remained calm. But when they neared the entrance of the women's quarters, the device began to beep irregularly. The man assumed interference, but when he stepped back, the device went silent. Forward again, it beeped. Again, backward, silence. This pattern continued several times. There were no power sources nearby. No cables. No signals. Only the hum of afternoon heat. He turned it off and put it away. There are stories, too, of travelers who saw nothing at all, only to feel the effects later. A young couple visited Bhangarh on their honeymoon in 2022. They spent the day exploring, saw no apparitions, heard no strange sounds. But in the weeks that followed, both began having the same dream. In it, they stood at the base of a staircase inside the palace. A woman stood at the top, her back turned. She never moved. She never spoke. But each night, they dreamed of her again, always in the same spot, always in silence. They shared the dream with each other only after weeks had passed, both shocked to hear the same details. Neither had spoken of it sooner, thinking it was a fluke. The dreams eventually stopped, but they have not returned to Rajasthan since. One of the most striking encounters comes from a former architecture student named Arnav. In his blog, he wrote about visiting Bhangarh with an academic lens, drawn to the blend of Rajput and Mughal design. He spent several hours drawing details from the gatehouses and interior facades. At one point, he entered a room with low ceilings, once used as a guard post. As he stepped inside, he heard a sigh. Not from behind, not beside, from the room itself. A soft, long exhale. Human. When he turned, nothing was there. He left immediately, only realizing later that the temperature had dropped nearly 15 degrees in that room alone. Despite these stories, Bhangarh remains open to the public each day. Tourists still come. Children laugh. Photos are taken. But at night, the place is locked. Not with reverence, but with caution. The signs do not explain themselves. The rules do not ask for belief. They simply state, Entry is not allowed after sunset. Perhaps this is for safety. Perhaps the structure is unstable. Or perhaps, as many suspect, the air itself changes once the sun drops beyond the cliffs. Perhaps the silence deepens. Perhaps something stirs. Or perhaps something waits. As time moves forward and technology brings the farthest reaches of the world into easy view, one might expect old ghost stories to fade. Places like Bhangarh Fort, with their worn stone and whispered tales, should soften under the light of modern understanding. Yet Bhangarh remains, still closed after dusk, still feared, still avoided by many who live near its outer walls. It is not the kind of fear that causes shouting or panic. It is a quiet fear, the kind that sits in the chest, that travels in silence through generations, passed not through written records but through tones and glances. Most of the people who live within a few kilometers of Bhangarh will not speak of it casually. When they do, their voice lowers. They do not embellish. They do not smile. One such person is a man named Harshad, now in his late 60s. He once worked as a forest officer helping with wildlife monitoring in the area near the Aravalli Hills. In his years walking the outer perimeter of Bhangarh, he never entered the main gate. But one day, he says, he lost track of a path and ended up just beyond the southern edge of the palace ruins. He describes hearing the sound of wood creaking, slow and rhythmic, like the kind made by old carts or shutters blowing in the wind. But there was no wind. He paused, listening. Then came another sound, faint weeping, not from close by, but from a place that felt far and near at the same time. A sound not carried by air, but carried inward toward the spine. Harshad left without seeing anything. But the next morning, his boots, which he had left outside his home, were covered in fine dust. Pale, gray, the same color as the dust found inside Bhangarh's inner courtyards. He never walked that path again. In recent years, attempts have been made to better understand the lingering sense of unease that surrounds Bhangarh. Some turn to psychology, some turn to spiritual theory, others to history. But the answers remain as hazy as the figures seen disappearing around corners. From a spiritual perspective, many believe that the land itself holds an imprint, a kind of emotional residue left behind by a large event or many small ones. These imprints are not intelligent nor alive, but they repeat themselves under the right conditions. A cry, a glance, a shadow walking a fixed route. They are described as echoes with form, as if time folded in on itself in just one place. This would explain why so many witnesses report the same experiences, the same eyes in the same window, the same footsteps, the same melody. These moments seem to belong to a loop, one that plays over and over again, unbothered by time. But there are others who believe the energy at Bhangarh is active, not an echo, but a response. These stories suggest a presence capable of noticing those who walk its paths. A presence that follows, that tests, that selects. Some say this is why certain travelers leave untouched, while others feel drained or return home with lingering effects, as though the place had reached out and touched something. From a psychological angle, Bhangarh has been studied as a case of collective suggestion. The idea that the stories themselves, told enough times by enough people, create a kind of mental feedback loop. That once inside the gates, visitors become highly suggestible, hyper-aware of the air, the shadows, their own heartbeats. Every sound becomes sharper, every silence more oppressive. But this theory struggles when confronted with physical experiences: watches that stop working, batteries that drain instantly, and photos that blur in specific areas while others remain clear. Most unsettling are the shared dreams, often reported by visitors who travel together and experienced similar visions without ever discussing them beforehand. One example occurred in 2018 when a group of 4 architecture students spent the afternoon sketching in the outer gardens. They left feeling inspired, saying little about the eerie atmosphere. But within a week, 2 of them described dreams in which they stood at the base of a staircase, looking upward toward a figure dressed in white, unmoving. They had not spoken of it before. The other 2 students later reported dreams as well. Similar images. Same location. There was no storm. No incident. Only stillness. Repeated across 4 minds. And then there is the final question, the one no scholar or spiritualist can quite answer. Why has no one reclaimed Bhangarh? The land could be cleared. The walls could be rebuilt. Hotels could be erected along its perimeters. Tourism could be expanded. And yet it remains untouched. No priest has consecrated the grounds. No exorcist has declared it clean. No restoration project has dared to break ground. It is not simply a matter of red tape or money. Other ruins of similar age and condition have been reclaimed, repurposed, revived. But not Bhangarh. One possible reason is what some refer to as the acceptance of sacred boundaries. In many parts of India, and indeed throughout the world, there is an understanding that some places do not belong to the living anymore, that they have passed into another realm of ownership, not cursed exactly, not evil, but kept by something unseen, something that may once have been part of our world but now exists beside it. Even the government's official policy reinforces this boundary. The Archaeological Survey of India continues to post the same simple rule: entry after sunset is not permitted. There is no elaboration, no dramatic signage, no mention of ghosts, only quiet enforcement. The locals have their own rules. No cooking near the fort, no prayer inside its walls, no sleeping near the temples. These rules are not written. They are simply followed. One man, a vendor near the outer gate, explained it best when asked why people obey these rules even without being forced. He looked down, then replied, "It's not about belief. It's about respect." And perhaps that is why Bhangarh remains one of the most powerful haunted sites in the world. Not because of its stories, not because of its legends, but because of how many people do not question them. The number of sightings grows slowly each year. Not loudly, not in crowds, but one person at a time. A photographer who sees a shadow where there should be none. A child who hears anklets behind her though she walks alone. A woman who dreams of a faceless girl combing her hair beside a broken wall. These moments are not written in textbooks. They are not measured in temperature drops or sound decibels. They are recorded in memory, in breath, in the small pause that follows a quiet realization that something is still here, and perhaps always will be. So if you ever visit Bhangarh Fort, stay a while. Let the sun rest against the stone. Feel the dust beneath your shoes. Watch how the shadows lean as the day grows long. And when the light begins to fade, leave with respect. Not with fear, not with doubt, but with silence. Because if the stories are true, and even if they are not, it's best not to stay after dark, just in case something is watching.